Hello, and welcome to EcoLit, a very special series on Trafike Europe Radio, featuring works and wisdom from authors and poets in vital connection with our natural environments.
In this episode, host Ilka Demmler talks with Maltese author Loranne Vella, focusing on her novel, Rokit, and the future she has created in this book, a shattered world marked by the consequences of climate change.
Hello and welcome to Trafike Europe Radio. My name is Ilka Demmler and I'm very happy to welcome here with me today in our studios the Maltese author and translator Loranne Vella. Hello, Loranne.
Hello, Ilka. Thank you for inviting me to your program.
It's my pleasure. So you are a writer and a translator, and you write in Maltese. You have already published several titles in Maltese from different genres, such as a fantasy trilogy for children and a short story collection, and an eco-fiction novel, Rokit, on which we are going to focus today here in this interview. And Rokit has been published in 2017 in Maltese by Merlin Publishers, and it received the National Book Prize in 2018, what is really impressive. And it's an amazing and complex work that you did there. The story it tells is also set in the future. So I would like to ask you to first give us a short overview over the story and describe the future that you did set the story in.
Yeah, so Rokit is set in the future. It starts in 2064, and we are in Europe, and it's a very different Europe to the one we are familiar with. So the world of Rokit is a dystopian one. There is no longer unity. Europe is fragmented. Even telecommunication systems are down. Traveling is not as frequent as, not as frequent as it was in 2017 for sure, because we've seen some changes recently. And behind all this, there are the effects of climate change. So there are disasters where it comes to temperatures, for example. And this is examined in more detail when the story goes to Malta. From around Europe, with the main character Petrel, we are traveling with him in the beginning. He is traveling because he's a war journalist, a war photographer actually. So he's one of the few people who can travel around. And at the age of 21, his grandmother dies in an accident and he feels guilty. He feels responsible for that accident. So one way of dealing with grief and guilt is to go back to her country. We realize at the end of the first section that she is Maltese, but he knows a lot about Malta. He can speak the language, but he's never been to Malta. So we see him traveling to Malta. He needs to go there for a few weeks, he says, just to come to terms with his grandmother's death. This is important because she is the one who raised him. He doesn't know his parents. And what happens there is that he goes there also to find his roots, and it can be difficult to not get entangled in one's own roots. So he does get entangled, and 25 years later, he's still there. And what he finds in Malta is he knows it as a small island in the middle of the Mediterranean. And what he sees there is very different to what his grandmother had described to him as he was growing up. So it's Malta in 2064, and it's a very particular year. It was 50 years from when I started writing, so I tried to envisage a future. How will life be in 50 years' time? And what he finds is that after 100 years of independence, so Malta has always been, up to 1964, had always been besieged, colonized, conquered, invaded. There was always foreign rule. And in 1964, we gained independence. But when he goes back in 2064, he realizes that once again, Malta is under foreign rule. And what is to blame? Who is to blame for this new invasion is actually climatic conditions. So to a certain extent, the country was besieged by rise in temperature, tsunamis, and to such an extent that the island was depopulated. It started getting evacuated, and at its weakest point, it was then invaded by another country. So in this case, it was Italy, and I tried to make a connection. I thought of a future that resembles the past. Sometimes we can create a future that is like an exaggeration of technological progress, or else we can imagine a future where things are actually more similar to how they were before. So this is the future in Rokit. No telecommunication systems, no traveling. Everything is fragmented and there's no unity.
And I very much like this about the story, because in the book you refer to this as the circularity of time. So we seem not to be able to learn from our mistakes, and history seems to repeat itself again and again and again. And I was wondering if you think that maybe there is still hope that we be able to learn from our mistakes, especially in regard to climate change, and if maybe we learn and then we'll be able to make the necessary changes so we can stop such a future, as you describe it in your book, from becoming reality.
I realized that there's always a sense of hope in my writing. It's the way that I face the world. I can see that things might not be so beautiful or things are not working really well, but I always have this sense of hope that mankind will find a way of solving these problems or coming to terms with them in a positive way. In Rokit itself, there is this for sure. The whole passage is about that. What needs to be done. There is always a group of people who fight for a resolution of all these problems. In Rokit, it's mostly political, but there's also the climatic conditions in the background, and there are moments where we actually see the revolutionaries in Rokit, for example. After 300 days of no rain, suddenly there's rain falling and they're trying to save the water. This is one way for me to tackle this. But with regards to the future in general, what I believe is that we have a responsibility, individual and collective, to make sure that the way we foresee the future, we try to avoid the catastrophe that seems to be impending. And there is so much we can do. And I keep saying this, that it's on an individual basis, yes, but also on a collective scale. We are helpless on our own to deal with the devastation that can come with temperatures rising, shortage of rain, shortage of water, erosion, which will eventually result with food shortages and so much. And for example, with the case in Malta, being an island, I think it becomes even urgent to deal with these changes.
Yes, that was something I also was thinking about, because as someone from Europe, Malta is not really always in my thoughts because it's a really small country. But as an island, and especially because of its location so close to Africa, it also has already this huge problem with refugees, which you also thematize in Rokit. And climate change will even worsen the situation, especially for Malta with refugees, as well as with the freshwater resources, which are already quite a shortage, and it's getting less every year. But how will the situation develop in regard to these points? Or how do you hope that they might develop? How can we change the current development?
Rather than what I did in Rokit is actually consider the fact that with climate change, the situation of refugees is going to change the reason for leaving your country to seek refuge in another country. It might no longer be just a political reason, but it could be a climatic one, that your country is no longer livable. So this for me was a very important issue, especially because it turns things around in the sense that what could happen is that at the moment it's Malta who is receiving people who are running away from the country. But what if in the future it is the Maltese themselves who will have to leave their own country to seek refuge in a safer country, and safer not just politically but also geographically and climatically? Obviously, there is a very strong connection between what is happening with the climate and how this will impact politics and geopolitics. So I don't have an answer to your question in the sense that I don't know exactly. I'm not a politician myself, so I wouldn't know exactly how to resolve this huge, immense issue. What I can only do, and what I have done with Rokit and also with a previous novel, which is also eco-fiction, Magna Mater, is to portray a future where this is going to be a huge issue, and this is not just fiction. It is a reality. It is a reality today already, which is just going to become worse in the future. So I can only do this this is the way I work. This is my platform of protest. If I need to protest about something, is to do it in my writing. I don't necessarily use literature as a form of activism, but obviously I do deal with these very hot issues in the way I write.
Yes, and in the way that you treat these topics, you remind the reader about them and you make them think about it. And I think that is really important because many just ignore the problem on hand and we're like, yeah, it's going to be well. I can just keep on living and maybe in 100 years I will be dead, so I don't care. But in 2064, I will still be alive. You will still be alive. So we realize that it is an urgent matter. And maybe now would be a great time to hear a little excerpt from the novel itself, so we can see the way you paint these really strong images in your writing.
So the part I'm going to read comes at the end of the second section. The second section of the book is called Maltese Rock. And at this point, it's as if the camera zooms out from the scene we would have just seen between two characters, where we have a very important moment between these two characters. And suddenly we zoom out to see what is happening on a sort of bigger scale to the whole country. And we see that it is not ravaged by the soldiers that have invaded the country, but also by extreme weather conditions and winds and rising sea levels and so on. So this is what I will be describing. Is-sajf ġab miegħu temperaturi għoljin, sħanat kbar, nixfa u nirien. Il-bajiet ma baqgħux jattirawhom lill-għawwiema bħalma kienu għamlu għal sekli sħaħ. Jekk fil-passat il-baħar kien itaffi mis-sħana u t-tidlik tal-jiem sajfin, wara l-ħerba li kienu ħallew warahom l-arar u l-maremoti, ħadd ma ġitu l-ħajra jinżel fl-ilma biex jirrilassa u jiffriska ruħu. Il-baħar kien sar ċimiterju sħiħ. U s-sħana kellhom itaffuha mod ieħor billi jibqu ġewwa matul il-jum u joħorġu biss ma nżul ix-xemx. Sa fl-aħħar bdiet ix-xitwa u x-xemx ma baqgħetx tiżreġ bla qiegħda. Minflok niżlet il-borra u n-nies raġu baqgħu mgezzin fi djarhom. Aħjar borra milli x-xita bdew jaħsbu huma u jitolbu biex dix-xitwa ma terġax tagħmel xita bħas-sena ta' qabel u tarraq kollox. Imbagħad f'nofs Marzu ġiet sħaba tar-rmiet li tagħthom xifmu li kien reġa' żbroffaletna. L-irmiet eret ħafna mill-uċuħ tal-għelieqi u bosta bejjem fl-irtsiset fawdex mietu wkoll. Meta fl-aħħar niżlet ix-xita, natfet kull memm mill-irmiet u tat ftit nifs ġdid lil kulħadd. Iżda x-xemx tas-sajf reġgħet kienet qalila, kif kienet ukoll ix-xitwa ta' wara u ta' wara dik ukoll.
Wow, that was great. It's the first time that I hear Maltese in my life, so it really sounds like a great language. And we'll talk about the language later, but now first still the English excerpt, please.
Summer brought high temperatures, severe heat, drought and fires. The beaches ceased to attract bathers as they had done for centuries. In the past, the sea relieved the heat of the long summer days, but after the devastation left by floods and tsunamis, no one was tempted to go into the water to relax and cool themselves off. The sea had become a cemetery. The heat had to be alleviated in another way, by staying indoors during the day and only going out at sunset. Finally, winter came, and the sun was no longer shining incessantly. Instead, snow fell, and people huddled up in their homes to keep warm. Snow is better than rain, they began to think, praying that this winter it would not rain heavily again like the previous year and flood everything. Then, in mid-March, a cloud of ash appeared. Etna had erupted once more. It destroyed many of the crops in the fields, and most of the livestock on farms in Gozo died. When it finally rained, it cleaned everything up from the ashes and gave everyone a little breather. But the summer sun was cruel again, as was the winter after and the one after that. There are two comments I would like to make about this part. There is a moment where I say that the sea had become a cemetery. And for me, this was an important image because already the sea has become a sort of cemetery with so many lives lost at sea, with the refugees coming on boats to seek refuge, not necessarily on our island, but away from their homeland. So there was a time where we were witnessing so many tragic accidents at sea, and I put in this image of the sea as a cemetery also to remind people that this is not just something that will happen in the future, it's already happening now. And the second point is that this particular passage, talks about high temperatures, severe heat, and then rainfall, and it's something that we are already witnessing only recently. I think it was just a few days ago. It rained in one day the same amount of rainwater as it normally would rain in 1 month. It's something that was never recorded before, apparently. So we can talk about this as if it were fiction, but obviously these things are already happening.
Yes, and it shows that the whole story and the things that are happening are based on things that are true, that are reality for so many people already. Like you said, a lot of rain in Germany. We just had floodings that destroyed the houses and the homes of so many people. And we obviously weren't prepared for something like this. I think also a really important matter to wake people up so they start preparing for such events, or maybe to start fighting against these changes. And I think this passage also was really impressive because it did show the connection between all the different problems and the different events, such as you said, so high temperature. So this means floodings, but also really dry phases. Then we have the problem of hunger. So we don't produce enough food for the people. And all of this is connected, and we need to see the big picture to start understanding which small steps we can take to change it. And I think that's something that is also closely related to photography. Before you said we zoom out, you also have this photography aspect in the book. And what made you combine these two art forms in a way? So we have photography and literature.
I think I have always combined them in the sense that when I write, I have an image in my mind. I also go to photographic exhibitions. I love going to see photos by other people. They are very inspiring. I find them to be very inspiring. And sometimes I also have my own collection of photos to look at. And in the beginning, when I started writing this story, I realized that each new passage I was writing, I was using a photo. It could be a photo I would find by accident or something that I would look for. And it would inspire me to start writing. And at a certain point, I realized that the characters could be photographers. And in fact, Petrel, the main character, and his grandmother Rika, they are both photographers. But eventually I realized that this is not enough for me. So it has to be more. Photography has to become even more important. And so it becomes a metaphor for various reasons. First of all, the idea of framing reality, looking at something and maybe isolating a detail from the rest of the context for different reasons. It could be also to present reality in a particular way, so the veracity of that detail is then put into question. But also, and I think it becomes more important in this sense, the idea of perspective and this idea of zooming in and zooming out. And this sort of, when we zoom in, we can really see a detail, but we lose the picture, or we cannot see the whole picture. And then when we zoom out to see the whole picture, we miss the details. And I do this with Petrel in the beginning. He is traveling around the continent, even around the world. So he is master of the entire globe to a certain extent. And then suddenly, to find his own roots, he himself zooms into tiny Malta. And when he goes there, he finds that it is actually divided into sectors. And if you go into a sector, you cannot really travel to the other sector. So it's really the smallest place possible. And so then you really zoom into the reality of these people who are oppressed and they have been invaded. They are living a difficult life, but you cannot connect with the rest of the world. So this idea of perspective is taken from photography. And then towards the end, it becomes even more important because when the story takes us to the labyrinthine passages underground where the revolutionaries are living, and then at the end they find this camera oscura, which will help them see the island above. So they have been condemned to live in darkness and underground, and they can only see this with this one ray of light, which sort of gives them the bigger picture. So I'm always playing with this idea of perspective. And the rocket itself, when it finally leaves the Earth and Petrel is on the rocket, it's a symbolic moment rather than a real one. And this idea of being launched into outer space, and only then could he see the entire globe. So the idea of Rokit is not meant to be this sci-fi novel where there is space travel. It's more metaphoric. That it's a metaphoric device where this was the only way that he could uproot himself from the globe and distance himself enough to look at it from far away and see this is where I'm from.
Oh, wow, that's great. And changing perspective is really something that is very important, especially in the moment, because we only can see the world from our eyes with our background. But if we want to understand other people's actions or how they behave, then we need to kind of change positions with them and change our perspective into theirs. And then we see, okay, he does that not because he's rude, but because he has this and this reason for it. And I think this is also something that is quite strong in your novel, this power to change perspective. But now I would like to talk a little bit about the Maltese language, because you work as a writer, but also as a translator for the European Union. And you started writing only after you moved to Brussels and you started this translation work there. So how would you describe your relation to the Maltese language during your lifetime, and has it developed in certain points of your life?
So I always spoke in Maltese, in the sense that Maltese is my mother tongue and is the language that we spoke at home with my parents and my relatives, with my friends. However, I was living at a time where we were expected to speak in English at school, or rather, I used to go to a church school and we were asked to speak in English. Maybe it was one way of practicing the language. However, there was this difference that at school we talk in English and at home we speak in Maltese. And then when it came to writing in general, so it's even writing a letter, I think I always used to write in English. Even my diaries from that time, I used to write in English. But it's not because I felt that English is more important or Maltese language is less important. It's just that sort of I speak Maltese, but I write in English. All my exams at the time were in English. I studied English at university, so everything was in English. So even my short stories at the time, which were never published, they were never intended to be published, were in English. And then when I was preparing myself to become a translator, and especially once I did start working, so I started with the European Parliament in Luxembourg, and one of the best tips I was given by my head of unit at the time, I must have mentioned this several times, but it's really important. He said, just make sure that you only write in Maltese. If you receive emails in Maltese and from people who understand Maltese, just make sure you reply in Maltese. So I took that really seriously. So even till today, I send text messages in Maltese. If I write a birthday card, it's in Maltese. So that was a sort of change. And now I don't even think about it. That's how it is. So what I felt was that working abroad, living away from Malta, now it's been like 16 years away from Malta, but still working with the Maltese language, it's my working tool. This becomes a really strong connection for me with my own story, my own country, my own culture. The Maltese language has become much more important to me now than it was before, when it was taken for granted. Because I lived in Malta, we spoke Maltese, you don't think about it. But this distancing suddenly puts into perspective certain aspects of identity, particularly. And these matters then find themselves in my novels. Rokit is my way of dealing with this sort of separation from my own country and questioning of my identity and of my roots. It's all there. So that is the way it has developed for me. And for me, when I realized that Maltese has become an official EU language, that for me really meant a lot, because it meant that it is not just a language of this 500,000 people living on the island, but it is now much bigger than that.
And I think that is great, because the linguistic diversity in Europe is something that is really important for identity, but also for our culture. And it's great that for the last decades, we started to protect these traditions, also in other countries like the Basque language or the others, minority languages especially, because English is a great language and it's spoken by so many people. So it's really a great tool, but it also loses its special identity, its core, because it's spoken by everyone, and it is changing a lot because it's getting mixed with other languages. But in Maltese, is there a lot of change in the language or the culture? Or do you say that the Maltese keep their traditions as pure as possible?
Languages are always developing, obviously. It's difficult to just fix them in a particular time. That would mean the death of a language. Yes, it has changed during these 16 years in which I've been working as a translator. I've seen so many changes in the language itself. So many decisions have been taken, for example, with regards to spelling, that important. New words are always coming in. And also there's these discussions, healthy discussions, I would say, as to what words to use for particular technical terms that are emerging, from technological terms that you need to use in the reports themselves, but also because if we're writing reports for the web, we need to use a particular language or style. So what words will we use for that? And this is an interesting discussion which keeps the language alive, I'd say. If we were to just say, oh, there is a word in English, we can just use that and everybody accepts, I'd worry a bit. The fact that there is resistance becomes interesting, because that resistance means that maybe there's a better way of saying it in our own language. And I try to work a lot in this sense. When, for example, when I was writing Magna Mater, which is also set in the future, and then with Rokit, which some people have called like science fiction, speculative fiction, which you don't normally find in Maltese. There are not that many novels written in that genre. One reason is that do we have the words for that kind of story. And for me, it becomes interesting to see how to write these stories, not if, but how. And this is something I do with every project I have, every novel or collection of short stories. I try to identify not just the themes, but also the kind of language that I will use for that work.
And that's great to see that language is not only a tool, but it is a living creature in a way, and this is changing and developing all the time. And you just mentioned that in Maltese, there aren't many books of a specific genre, but how would you describe the Maltese literary scenes in general, or are there any names of this scene besides yourself, of course, where you would say that these are great representatives of Maltese in literature?
I would say that there's so much going on at the moment. These past 15 years have been amazing, maybe because suddenly the Maltese language has been given prominence, not just as our language, but also as an EU language. And I think that would be one reason. And the second is that with so many translators now, I think before we had translators, but translation into Maltese wasn't as important as it is today. So with so many more people really working with the Maltese language, it so happened that many of these people also started writing literature. I wasn't the only one. There are so many I could mention. There's Alex Velagera, there's Clara Zopardi, Walid Naban, to name but a few, who are amazing, and also poets. There's Nadia Mifsud, Liane Lul. So much is going on. So many works are published every single year. It's an amazing for such a small island. Even I'm always amazed by the amount of books that are published every year in Maltese. It's also thanks to the National Book Council of Malta that all these projects have been taking place, because with the National Book Council, who offer book funds and publishing funds and translation funds, it becomes more possible. So the council helps writers a lot, but also publishers. They are helped a lot, especially last year with all the problems that arose from the pandemic. Everybody was being helped by the council. So yes, there's a lot going on from the literature point of view, also culturally. I think you'd be amazed. Such a small country, but a lot is going on.
Yeah, and that's impressive. I'm really happy that the scene is not dying out, but it's even growing bigger and getting more importance, because I think that is really something that in this time especially is also very important. And literature in general, I even have the feeling that it is gaining on importance in situations, because when something is difficult, I always think that a book will help me, because somebody will already had this same problem, and maybe I will find the answer to the solution to my problem in books. This is one of the great powers of books. And are you currently working on a new project? Anything we might expect in the future?
Yes, actually, I have just finished working on my new novel, which is set to come out in May, 1st May 2022. So I used my time during the past 2 years when we were confined at home to work on this new novel. It's very different from Rokit. So it's not set in the future. It doesn't deal with climate change. It deals with other forms of oppression. And this time round, I focused mostly on feminism, on women's rights, reproductive rights, the gender question, the transgender question. So it's a polyphonic novel with 5 different characters, and we get their story. And little by little, we see how it's basically one story with 5 voices. And it also deals with a very important issue, not heavily, but it's dealt with in the novel, the issue of abortion, which is being discussed still in Malta. So I felt it's time to tackle that.
Wow, these are really important topics, and it sounds like a really amazing story. So hopefully I will read it in the future in English while I learn Maltese. We'll see.
Yes, there is. I was going to mention it before. There is now a publishing house. It's a new publishing house in London that is concerned specifically with publishing Maltese literature in translation. And they have just come up with the first two titles, and the first one is actually the translation of one of my books. It's called Collection of Short Stories. That is something that I wanted to mention before about what's happening in the literary scene in Malta. And I think that, as you said, with Maltese being spoken by not so many people, the solution would be translation. So I'm very happy with this initiative.
Yes, it's a really great project. I think I heard about the publishing house. So I will keep an eye on them.
Yeah, Praspar Press, they're called.
Perfect. So everyone who's interested in Maltese language, keep this name in mind. And for now, I would like to thank you, Loranne, for this amazing interview and that you did take the time today to talk with me. And I hope to see a lot more of you in the future.
Thank you, Ilka, and thank you, Trafike Europe, for this opportunity.
This has been Maltese author Loranne Vella, focusing on her novel, Rokit, and we've heard an excerpt from the novel performed bilingually.
Ecolit is a series on Trafike Europe Radio, featuring works and wisdom from authors and poets in vital connection with our natural environment. Please sign up on our live stream page to stay informed on future shows. On behalf of all of us here at Trafike Europe Radio, I'm Andrew Singer, wishing you a great day.